Hi, everyone. It's Ian Giles,
I'm James McNabb.
and we're doing another episode of Leadership Unscripted. And tonight, I'm very excited to say I've got an old colleague and friend who's going to join us today. He's the CEO and co founder of Brainsights. We were just saying that it's probably been 10 years since we last saw each other in person. And so when we last saw each other, we were working together at a company called MediaCom in the media planning and strategy business. And then after that, he left to start Brainsights. So welcome, Kevin.
Wow. Okay. So thanks for having me, you guys. And obviously, Ian, great to see you. James, great to meet you. Um, Back when we were at MediaCom, I had spent the majority of my career in data marketing. I suppose you can kind of, wrap it all up in that. Everything to do with, measurement, attribution, market mix modeling, data informed marketing strategy, ROI modeling, basically. And at MediaCom, as started the MediaCom Business Science Unit, which was all about market mix modeling and just more advanced media planning through a data-informed, ROI modeled strategy for clients. One of the things that I, could never wrap my head around and could never answer for clients at that time was what how does my creative actually perform? How does my actual advertising perform? So if you know anything about market mix modeling, it really relies on, the weight that you have in the marketplace and how that changes. What I mean by that is like, how many impressions am I serving? How does that change the actual dependent metric of revenue? It was really difficult to decompose that from how my advertising, my actual creative message performed. Now there's ways that you can do that now. But at the time, we set off to answer that question. And so, people had asked the question, well, what about, my brand tracking? What about my ad tracking? And I was like, well, how are you actually evaluating that? Right. And be like, well, our brand tracker is a regular survey that goes out. It's like, okay, so you're asking people how advertising, influences them. Is that right? We're like, yeah, that's right. And like, do you see a problem with that? And everything that we know about how advertising works, it happens at the unconscious level, the subconscious mind, right? So how can you possibly expect someone to be able to articulate that and cop to how they're feeling about your advertising? And this was like the big disconnect that we just could never really resolve, right? And so, at the time, there was obviously this emerging discipline that combined the principles of neuroscience with marketing. And that's where we decided to play. So we started Brainsights back in 2013 with the mission of effectively enabling all marketers to access the principles and data of neuroscience, right? So, our job was to make it affordable even for the Canadian marketer, right? So if you know anything about Canadian marketing budgets, not exactly as plentiful or not exactly as plush as our cousins to the south. And so we needed to make something that was competitive, affordable, accessible, and we built an EEG-based solution that measure people's brain activity as they're consuming content. And we've built this massive database of brain data linked to content stimuli for thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the intervening 10 years, working all around the world, Canada, US, UK, Germany, Spain, India. We're actually in the midst of pitching for some work that goes even further afield. And so, yeah, we're taking this thing global. I mean, it started in literally like my like the first thing I ever did with Brainsights was I threw a brain food party. And the brain food party was really about us testing out our initial prototypes. And I'm kind of an amateur cook. I love cooking, right? And I was cooking up these salmon fish cakes, halibut ceviche, I had a signature cocktail, pomegranate, blueberry cocktail. So, very rich in like omega-3s, antioxidants, brain food, right? And the cost of entry was you needed to sit, put this headset on, and watch 20 minutes of Super Bowl ads. And that was the cost of entry, and that got you into the party. And that all happened in my condo media room. Um, like way
Wow,
back when. And that was
got
like
to start
that's
somewhere.
that's the origin story. That's the origin story of the company, and kind of in a nutshell what we do, and what we've been doing for the last 10 years.
I'm just so curious. How have you been able to correlate the brain data you captured with people's, emotional or subconscious response to the advertising, or subsequently track it through to purchase decisions in the marketplace?
So a couple of ways. Number one, just rooted in the science of EEG. So EEG has been around for 100 years, 110 years, and it it collects data on naturally occurring brain waves, and those brain waves are associated with specific mental states that are of interest to marketers. Levels of attention, like an emotional resonance, so a depth of connection that's happening with the stimuli. Levels of cognitive effort and cognitive load, right? So is something very difficult to understand. Levels of memory store activation. So if you think about those things, right, you're thinking about, do I have your attention? Am I resonating with you? Am I activating memory stores and associations? Is my shit difficult to understand or not? So all of those things are of interest, right? So that's number one. Number one is the science. Number two is just independent verification of behavioral validation. So looking at how our recommendations join up with what happens in the marketplace for our clients, and our clients feeding back that data to us. This is how we're breaking through. This is how we're improving our recall, our intent. This is how we're improving our bottom line, and then basically over time, um, establishing patterns in our data, what we know to be effective storytelling, what we know to be really strong stimuli in engaging people, in converting people, where we see heightened levels of attention, emotional connection, and coding to memory. What does that mean? Where it happens in the ad. Does that tell us, about the strength of the signal and the potential for behavioral outcomes in the marketplace? All of those have been built up over the last 10 years, and I'd be lying if I said that it was immediate, right? Like, our understanding of humans, we're dealing with the most complex organism that has ever existed, right? In the human brain, we have to remain humble. We have to remain curious. Our focus is on generating as big a data set as we possibly can to better understand um, human bias, human understanding, how we each process information, the factors that influence how we process information, what we attune to, what we decide to encode to memory. Um, but we have had long-standing relationships with a number of large brands, and that can, for us, only mean that they continue to find value in our solutions, whether that's in mitigating the risk of going to market with a specific message to a diverse audience, and or seeing the business outcomes that they want to in the marketplace based on the recommendations that we provide them. So these are the data points kind of captured along the way, right? And we continue to refine and build out our metrics and our understanding. And it's been an incredible journey. It's been a crazy one, but one where we've been grateful to have some really exceptional brands that we work with that are open and transparent and helping us be better.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question I have for you. Your work involves leveraging consumer neuroscience to transform marketing strategies. Could you share with us a key success story where your insights led to a remarkable shift in how a company approached its target audience?
Sure. I mean, I can share a couple. Um, a remarkable shift. So, Ian, when we were at MediaCom, the mantra at MediaCom for media planning was video anywhere, right? Video everywhere, which I always thought was ridiculous, right? And what that meant was, hey, you give us a video asset and we'll place it across all these different screens, right? You got mobile, you got, laptop, you got cinema, TV. And I was like, well, wait a second. Isn't the way that we consume video different across all of those different environments? Like, why are we saying that like the same thing can just be like sprayed and prayed like across all of those environments? Like, aren't we kind of shooting ourselves in the foot here? Like, isn't media planning supposed to be planning media? It's supposed to be understanding what's going on there. And so that was another one of the motivations why I wanted to leave MediaCom at the time, because I was just like, you know what? I just want to like completely prove this wrong, because this is horseshit, right? Like, there's no way that like the same ad played on TV or played in cinema is going to have the same impact as it played in mobile, consumed on mobile. I'm sorry, but it's just like, it didn't compute for me. And that led to one of the most famous studies I can honestly say of the last 10 or 20 years. And that was the Microsoft attention span study that we were the neuro partner for. And it was our first big project back in 2014, doing data collection in 2014, and then releasing the study in 2015. It went viral, not for the best reasons, if I'm being honest, right? So there was a lot of nuance. Virality and nuance are not things that really like are compatible, cohabit, right? So there's a lot of nuance that was lost in this headline that human attention spans are now shorter than goldfish. You guys have probably heard that. Be surprised if you hadn't. I'd be actually glad if you hadn't, to be honest, because like that was something that our study was misattributed in saying. There was a lot more nuance to it. But anyway, what all of that had precipitated was a renewed focus by the industry on attention. Now, attention is like the huge thing now. Back in 2014, 2015, we had basically pioneered a renewed interest in attention as a something to study in media. And lo and behold, it also proved that, watching a video on TV versus, on laptop, on mobile, like there's just different responses, right? And we've continued to prove that over and over and over and over again. Now, attention isn't the only thing that changes, right? Context shapes cognition, right? It's one of the big things that like we continue to find. If I consume something in one environment, it's not necessarily the case that I will consume it in the same way in a different environment. That's the whole premise of like, consuming the same video on mobile versus on laptop versus on TV, etc. So one of the big things that we've learned is context shapes cognition. And context is not just kind of socioeconomic context. It's not just, we pay attention to, different things based on what's top of mind, based on what's algorithmically served to us, but it's like context in terms of channel, right? And that changes things significantly. We then applied this learning, this understanding, and this is something that was written up in Strategy magazine, to one of our clients, CIBC, and watched the performance of their video advertising go up significantly as a result of some of those principles and applying those principles. So that's kind of number one, which is basically like this idea of testing and optimizing creative by context, or like the channel creative mix, right? Because again, context shapes cognition. So that's one piece. We also do a lot of concept testing that allows our clients to manage narrative risk. So it's not just about how strong an idea is. You think about animatics, right? You guys are familiar with animatics and like animated storyboards and that kind of thing. You put it in front of focus groups. Hey, which one did you like better? Did you like when they said this or that or whatever? James and I were talking previously about, some of the issues with stated response, explicit response, and trying to access how we emotionally react to stimuli or situations or what actually drives our decision making. We worked with Pizza Hut to test two concepts that were brilliant, put together by their agency Ogilvy. There's a case that on our site, so I'm perfectly free to share the ins and outs. One of these concepts was going to cost a lot more than the other one to make, music licensing and these kinds of things, right? But they were both brilliant concepts. But what they needed to understand was which one of these was going to deliver the goods, and then was there a significant delta to be able to rationalize to the franchisees, to corporate, hey, you know what? We need increased money to be able to, we feel confident that this increased investment is going to deliver the returns. So there's a narrative risk attached to that too, right? Not just, hey, this concept is great, but the way that it's configured, the way that that story is told, there's risk in that too, right? Like we can tell stories in different ways and have different impact. The content is ostensibly the same, but the way that it's delivered, and this is the difference between the way that, say, Dave Chappelle delivers a joke and amateur comedian ABC delivers a joke, right? Like the difference between like an amateur and a goat, right? Like is that consistency and that composition, right? So narrative risk is incredibly important. And that was one of the things, because we're collecting data every 2 milliseconds, we can understand at a hyper granular level how people are processing things over time so as to mitigate creative narrative risk, so storytelling risk. And that was something that we had advised Pizza Hut on, not just saying, hey, green light on this specific concept. Yes, the delta is that big to rationalize the increased investment for the increased cost for production. And this is how you might want to tweak some of the narrative to ensure you're nailing it.
Can you unpack that a bit more? So, what was it that you saw that told you that this ad or this concept would perform better over that? So, what were the basically the neurological markers that you're looking at?
Totally, right? So we measure levels of attention, emotional connection, and encoding to memory every 2 milliseconds. We're doing that for hundreds of people in a target market for the customer. We're normalizing everyone's response because everyone's brain's different, everyone's skull's different, so everyone's going to have different levels of activity happening. So we basically created a processing engine to be able to compare Kevin's response to James' response to Ian's response to get that like for like comparison. And in that way, we can then aggregate it and understand, okay, well, how are people paying attention, to what degree, to what level, how is this stimuli resonating with them, what are they encoding to memory, and then how does that compare versus their individual baselines, right? So you stack up two concepts like for like, one against another. And then you also look at past Pizza Hut creative content, for example, to understand, okay, well, how does this perform vis-a-vis some of that past content, and then how does it perform against our concept benchmarks, so that we can feel very confident in saying this is the one you got to go to. And it's not just about the average levels of attention or average levels of emotional resonance and encoding to memory, but peak moments as well, right? Like oftentimes we're only taking away one or two things from a given ad. So where are those peak moments of encoding happening, right? Like encoding to memory. Do we have consistent pacing of high connection, high emotional moments? Comparing the two concepts, we get a very clear idea as to which one to go forward with. And then there's going to be key moments for the client too, right? Like, the opening, right? Like you want to make sure that you're grabbing attention right away. How versatile is that piece of content across a variety of different channels because of how quickly it'll capture attention? When the key call to action comes on screen, are we seeing, you know, heightened levels of attention, emotional connection, encoding to memory, right? Like, and you can see how that would be applied across a range of different types of businesses. We work with insurance clients, for example, when they're kind of, call us number comes on there, right? Like, do we see heightened levels of memory encoding? You know what I mean? Like when we work with some Olympic sponsors, when they present their brand, their logo alongside the five rings, do we see heightened levels of emotional connection and memory encoding so that the association is being built? So with respect to both CIBC across channel, like, context-based cognition, this is how you should go to market. And then Pizza Hut, like, mitigating risk. Those are some of the ways that our insights have transformed how brands go to market.
Prior to this kind of technology being possible, I think it was Millward Brown had a like a dial you could turn, and I was involved in the mid 2000s around moving that model online, so people could slide a slider as they're watching an animatic. I like it, I don't like it, but you're making a huge inferential leap to hey, this got a very liked response at this moment across a larger group of people, so that means it's good. Well, you've got one variable, it's self-reported, and it isn't tied to something like memory or cognitive load or emotional impact. None of that stuff is captured that way. And again, it would still have to be self-reported, which you cannot really rely on, even in kind of a big numbers kind of model. I find this is a tremendous leap over what existed before your company was doing what it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's we don't consume we don't consume media and advertising with our hand on any kind of dial. And then what happens when the dial gets to 10, but you want to go higher than 10? You know what I mean? Like you can't, right? Like so there's some limitation there. Like by all means, like we're always standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like we're always making those gains. Um, but I think with respect to how we actually consume content, and this is the issue with neuromarketing, up until the kind of bigger democratization of the technology, is that it was only really within the budgetary realms of the really big advertisers, right? Because they could rent out the university labs, they could hire in the legions of PhDs to make sense of fMRI data. They could, afford to ditch a whole bunch of that data if they needed to, but it just wasn't scalable, right? It wasn't scalable. It was hyper expensive. It was limited in terms of its actionability, for to solve real marketer problems. And so, this is what we wanted to address. We wanted to democratize the access to unconscious data from consumers, from people. And I should mention as well that it's not just big brands that were transforming or helping to transform, right? Like we've had some very strong pro bono partnerships over the years. And, those charities and not for profits have fed back to us that like our insights and storytelling optimization help them maximize, charitable donations, for example, and also help them, spare their own blushes in some instances. So, that there's things that brands and organizations of all sizes, anybody that is required to tell a story to a public audience in some way, can benefit from these kinds of insights, because again, it's going to tell you what people are interested in. It's going to tell you what people care about, right? And even as valuable, what people don't give a shit about, So like, how do you tighten up that storytelling, and how do you tell that story, across channel, across context, in a way that's going to resonate with as many people as possible? Those are the questions that we're answering.
Can you explain how the application of neuroscience can unveil unconscious biases in marketing strategies and reshape them for better inclusivity and effectiveness?
Yeah. I'll give you an example, actually, from a not-for-profit that we worked out. I'm not going to tell you who they are, only because I don't want to
For sure.
embarrass them. But
No
what
problem.
I'll lay out kind of what the scenario was. This was back in 2017. They were going to market with a pro refugee, pro immigration message. Just cast your mind back to 2017, early 2017, right? This was like the first year of Trump's presidency. He had just implemented a Muslim ban. They called it a Muslim ban. He was throwing up his wall like on the Mexican border, like in Canada there was a shooting at a mosque in Quebec City, like awful xenophobic, like racist attacks, right? So like the idea of coming out like very strongly pro-immigration, pro-refugee, vital, but also a little bit on the maybe a little on the scary side, right? Like for this organization, so they had to nail the narrative, because it was hot, right? Like the period of time was hot. We were working with them on this narrative. We had tested a couple of different iterations and had kind of advised them along the way. Very diverse audience, testing their brain, like basically testing the different concepts as it pertained to their brain activity. Just as we were about to kind of say, you know what, go for it, this is awesome, it's highly inclusive, we noticed something in the brain data, like a fairly substantial dip towards the end of this 60-second piece of film. And when we dug a little bit deeper, there was the potential for this particular scene to come across as very kind of white saviory. If that makes sense, right? Like, it involved this exchange between, a white person and an Asian person, and it would have come across as very like, white savior. We said, look, there's not much you guys can do in terms of like, we know that this is not your intention, right? Like, first of all, like, you're going to market with this film. We know it's not your intention. We wanted to let you know that this is happening in the brain data. There is a recoil, there is a withdrawal from the diverse set of audience, right? So not just BIPOC, but also white audiences that maybe feel uncomfortable in this moment. What you should do: pull forward the voiceover. Pull forward the voiceover, because this moment happened and then a voiceover happened that kind of like contextualized that moment and why it was significant. We said, you know what, pull forward that so that you're cueing audiences to listen to the contextualization of that moment, and it completely reframes that moment before you allow people to make up their own mind. Help them make their minds up before the visual is played, by just pulling forward the audio. And we retested it once it had aired, and that little blip went away entirely, which was amazing. It ended up like being a smash success, like for this organization, which was incredible. But it could have gone very differently, right? Like, you guys know the way that folks can pick up things on Twitter and then it just becomes like something you can't control anymore, right? So this was what we wanted to steer clear of, right? And tell the inclusive story that needed to be told, particularly at that time when it was so hot, it was so incendiary, right? There needed to be a voice in the marketplace that was sensitive, that was compassionate, that was pro diversity at a time where like xenophobia reigned, right? So like, that's just an example. It's a beautiful example. I wish, I hope I've done the case justice. So you like, without like, naming names, to give you a sense as to how we help to address these kinds of things, right? Because it's vital, right? It's vital that we nail those stories, because that's what's going to make more inclusive, diverse, equitable advertising possible. It's not just about, United Colors of Benetton in front of the camera. You know what I mean? That can be taken at sometimes like as tokenism, right? It's about storytelling, diverse storytelling behind the camera, right? And respecting that too, right? So it's that's something that we always look to bring to the table.
I think that's just amazing that you can get down to that level of specificity where there's, a risk from from that kind of a problem, and you're able to mitigate that almost entirely by, I guess, in some ways, by pulling that voiceover forward, you change the context of their viewing of that material, and then it shifts the way they interpret it.
Craft matters, right? Like you guys know, you've been in creative agencies, that craft matters. You know what I mean? Like the order of things. There are so many instances where seemingly innocuous events in ads just absolutely sink things or make them soar, right? Because of the order of things. It really matters. And yeah, I like it really mattered in that moment too, and I'm glad that we got it right.
I've got a question for you that's off script, of course. Um, the I've done a lot of work in user experience design, and it started out with doing a lot of usability testing. And we would, there's sort of the traditional thing where you ask somebody to do a task on a prototype, you see how long it takes them, and then we'd have multiple cameras set up to watch what they were doing, their hands, their face, and everything. And at the same time, I also was aware of, some ad testing that used, I guess, some kind of electro sensor on people's faces to test kind of like pre-smiles and different facial expressions, almost kind of like on a micro level. But what I found was, the management of a user's attention, the level of their cognitive load, the challenges they faced were not, those are things that people often tried to hide in a testing environment. They didn't want to be seen as somebody who wasn't capable of interacting with something, when the reality is you're dealing with a prototype, and the prototype might be hard to use, and we're trying to figure that out. And the actual participants in the studies would literally try to hide this stuff from you, and so you had to be very subtle and very roundabout in terms of getting to the information. And you realize that kind of there's a kind of a visual flow to things, there's sort of a logical flow to things, there's a sequencing of events and activities to get somebody from where they start to whatever the task was. And we worked on a whole variety of different kind of web interfaces as well as software products back in the time. Has this sort of technology been applied to that kind of a problem? I mean, I saw a lot of multivariate testing in sort of the mid 2000s that would always show massive improvements if you change this creative or change that creative, and you'd put it into practice and it would be almost negligible, right? So big promise, no impact. And so now I think, well, this would be incredibly valuable to see somebody using a product and, oh geez, the cognitive load went way up, and oh, the thing that they needed to remember for the next section of this activity, they had very low commitment to memory at that stage, and we need to do something about that. I mean, this seems to be a very significant, a very sophisticated diagnostic tool for exactly those kinds of problems.
And it has been applied to those kinds of problems as well, right? Like, I recall doing some UX work where we were focused on how do we optimize the onboarding, right? Like onto this specific tool. And they've like the client found it to be incredibly valuable because they basically had to accommodate like two very broad sets of users in the onboarding experience, what we called like skimmers and like instruction readers or whatever, right? Like like basically the people who are um like just surveying like the IKEA instructions, and the people that like read the full terms and conditions. You know what I mean? Like, and you kind of had to accommodate both, right? Like, the people that wanted the detail and the people that just like give me the highlights. You know what I mean? Um, and kind of anywhere in between. And that was something that like the client had no idea. And again, this is a very basic example, but like The client had no idea that those two, user groups even existed, and nor did they necessarily know how to craft content to appeal to them. So it was something that they found incredibly valuable. Like, again, like, the faster you get to onboard, I mean, this could be the difference of, like, you know, widespread tool adoption or abandonment. You know what I mean? Like, and if you can collapse that onboarding process down from, I don't know, I'm making this up, but like 20 minutes down to 5 minutes or whatever it happens to be, like, you're laughing.
You had mentioned earlier in the discussion about the video everywhere paradigm. And today, and you also mentioned how you're testing different platforms and behaviors different in different platforms. And so when you test um, recently, are you doing this multi-platform type of testing? Is that sort of just expected at this point because attention across different devices is completely different, and maybe even generationally attention across different devices are different? Have you noticed anything along those lines?
Is it expected? No. In fact, I don't know of any ad testing solution that tests across all the different video platforms. It just doesn't, in part because um, it's very difficult to do that. It's very expensive to do that. But also in part because there are very few brands that are across all of those different video platforms. If we're talking about all of them, right? These are differences across a number of them. That being said, we have done a ton of different testing across a ton of different environments. So we're often deployed for testing across a range of different environments. It won't be like dozens in any given test. It'll be like the big ones. And tasked with providing optimization advice and even uh, is it worth it advice to put a specific asset in a specific environment based on what the brain data is saying. And we've also developed sort of a little bit of a hack to it as well, what we call creative attention windows. Because again, if you come back to how we measure people's brain activity every 2 milliseconds, you can start to understand how quickly the content engages you, how quickly the content hooks you in. Does it happen within a 2 second window, a 1 second window? Does it happen within a 5 second window? And then that gives you a really good understanding as to where this is best going to play. If it attracts you within the first 2 seconds, you got a pretty decent, versatile piece of content that you can then be sure that it's going to hook people in. Now, what comes after that is a completely different set of asks that we help with. But if you nail those first 2 seconds, that's going to work well across a number of different environments. If you nail the first two and the first five, then you're in really good shape, because it basically means that you're hooking people right off the bat. You're kind of re-hooking them, if you like, in that kind of 5 second creative attention window, which is vital when you're thinking about, skippable environments on YouTube, when you're thinking about quote unquote skippable environments in a connected TV environment. Like, each of these things matters to get eyeballs and keep eyeballs on your content. And that's what we're tasked with advising clients. Now, there are obviously some stylistic and creative implications. Call them like playbooks by different media that we're building out for clients. But we do have like kind of a call it like a creative effectiveness hack to be able to advise clients on where best to place their assets.
In terms of something like, so I think you've answered the question very well in terms of how you would establish attention in that first 1 to 5 seconds, and I think that plays across all of them. Have you noticed, or has this sort of got into your testing? Have you tested things that you'd see in mobile behavior in social media, for example, with scrolling and having sound off? And has that sort of come into your testing at all?
So you're asking if we've tested video in scroll environments on mobile sound off?
It could be definitely played out like that, or have you kind of mimicked that kind of behavior with the way that you are doing the testing by testing sort of you did mention a voiceover before, but have you had text sort of as with the sound off and text, like any of these kind of behaviors that everyone talks about in social?
Yeah, anything that you can imagine being tested, we've probably tested it. Like, and I mean, I know that's like a short answer to a more complex problem, but like, you know, we've tested politics, we've tested porn, we've tested, PSAs, we've tested experiential, we've tested in retail, we've tested at concerts, at sporting matches, at sporting
Wow.
festivals, TV, mobile, laptop, in cinema. Like we've tested flyers, like we tested a lot of shit. Like we tested a lot of stuff,
That's amazing. And
like
over 10 years.
across the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you just end up kind of developing a big database of insights, and you start to see how that context-based cognition piece I was talking about like really works. And you also start to see why the creative attention windows work, right? So when we were talking about like we were doing some work actually for an ex mutual colleague of ours, Ian Mike Power, when he was at a sports marketing agency called SDI. I remember we're doing some stuff for one of their clients that ran like kind of big like sports based festivals. And think of them like kind of community events, right? That kind of wrap around like sports. And so we'd be testing attendees who would be walking in, they'd have like eye tracking goggles on, the EEG headset, like, and they'd be going into these different activations. Every single time they walked in somewhere new, and you can kind of see this, like you can kind of picture this in your mind, you'd be scanning the place, like, and you'd have heightened levels of attention and heightened levels of memory store activation as you are looking for clues for familiar things. And then when you find that familiar thing, your connection levels go up, right? So you should start to understand like kind of how the human mind works in scenarios that are very familiar for us all, and then why that maps to a creative video environment, right? Like, so you start to see. So, Dave, you'd asked about like validation, like over the years, and like understanding like behavior, and these are the types of clues you pick up along the way too, right? That like, huh? So that's why it happens that way, right? And it sounds so obvious when I say it, but like when you see it in the data, and you continue to see it in the data, you start to be like, okay, like I've seen that before, and that's really cool. Um, Another example is again in that festival setting, you're walking around and you run into people that people that you haven't seen in ages, right? Like, old teammates, right? Or people that used to live in the neighborhood or whatever, right? So these serendipitous, you know, connections that you establish or reestablish at these festivals, and you see like massive levels of connection that are occurring, and levels of memory store activation, like when these moments occur, that just kind of drive home the point about like familiarity and nostalgia, like linking to memory, like, you know what I mean? How do I know this person? Oh, remember the time when, you know what I mean? And like you just see these mechanisms that are firing in these moments, and you're hearing someone talk about them, and then you're hearing someone reflect on them, because they're kind of internal monologue, like, they kind of let this stuff slip every now and again, and it's a beautiful moment that underlines and further contextualizes what we see like in our regular testing. um and just goes and just validates the work that we're doing, right? And providing us with clues as to the, the complexity, but also sometimes the shared simplicity of the human experience.
Have you ever combined this with eye tracking studies, which is a great example of a study that tells you what people are doing, but you have no insight as to why or what it's supposed to mean?
Yep. Yep. So the two exa- so the so the one example I was mentioning before about UX research, we combine it with eye tracking, the stuff that we were talking about, like in concerts, at festivals, like yeah, experiential retail, combining them with eye tracking, it's quite powerful, right? And it provides obviously a level of like where the gaze is, and then how people are processing that information, and that also then makes its way into how we refine our metrics, our methodology, for some of the more kind of, call them, off the shelf solutions that we have.
I have one more question. So, based on this is 10 years, you started the story by looking at what wasn't happening in media planning and strategy and seeing this gap and opportunity, and that was the impetus to start this business. So now 10 years on and looking out into the future, the next, I was going to say 5 years, but it's probably 1 year now. Where do you see growing the business? Is there other types of scientific research that you'd like to bring in, or other ways that you'd like to work with clients based on everything you know for the past 10 years and where you want to go with this and how you see it expanding or changing in the next, 1 to 3 years?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we set out really to build a giant database of brain data linked to content stimuli, right? That was basically what we wanted to do. We just wanted to understand. We wanted to understand what made people tick, what were their biases, what were the influences behind those biases. So we went about collecting data, the neurological level, to various different stimuli from various different population groups, and just made a big database with those things. What I think Where I think it'll go now is, um, using AI to basically predict and model what people pay attention to, what they will encode to memory, what will resonate with them. I think it's going to be that. And I think it's going to be, my hope is that we can also use it to surface people's bias, for example, to news content,
Mm.
political content. We can use it to really just help people understand their information diet, right? And maybe provide a health warning. I don't know, provide a health warning for their information diet. Wouldn't that be neat? I think about what's in the data. I think about what I've learned. I think about, when I've been surprised, and then sadly when I haven't been surprised, whether or not it's kind of good or bad. And I think there's our objective now, having spent a lot of time, collecting that data over the last whatever decade. Our our objective really is to now kind of liberate that data, right? So that we can empower people to better understand themselves, better understand their own decision making, better understand one another, and maybe throughout that process, maybe hopefully, if we're lucky, we can restore just a little bit more empathy and compassion, where maybe that's been lost a little bit.
Well, this has been really interesting and so exciting to see what you've done over the last 10 years. And I can only imagine what's going to happen next. So thank you. And for people watching, if they want to read some of these case studies and learn more about your business, where do they go? What's your website?
Yeah, brainsights.com.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your time. This
Yeah,
has been great. And so we'll definitely have to do this again. And
totally,
you and I need to connect,
totally.
in the neighborhood.
So,
Absolutely.
and I'll bring James too, because
Yeah,
he's
Yeah,
close
perfect.
by too. So
please.
we'll all
I,
meet.
Perfect.
I feel like this is a conversation that could go on for another 2 hours if we had the time. There's
Yeah,
so much to
absolutely.
unpack here, and I'm so curious about even the insights you have after doing this for this period of time and the application of those. So I think there's
Yeah,
so much more to dig into here. But yeah, thank you very much. This is a wonderful discussion to have.
perfect. Well,
Excellent.
thanks a lot, you guys,
Thank
and good
you.
luck with everything. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Take
Okay.
care, guys. We'll
Cheers, guys.
talk soon.